In 630, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, which controlled Central Asia, fell and vanished. As they say, nature abhors a vacuum, so the power struggle was just beginning. The Turkic peoples who inhabited it did not go anywhere, nor did the Uighurs disappear. On the contrary, it was they who had to take on one of the most difficult roles in the history of the region. They found themselves on the front line between the steppe and China, at the intersection of two worlds. The Uighurs became the very buffer that held back Chinese expansion to the north and at the same time prevented the steppe tribes from completely falling apart. When the Eastern Turkic Khaganate collapsed under the blows of the Chinese, the vast steppe was left without a single center of power. Each alliance and tribe acted independently, seeking new ways to survive. In the north, the Kyrgyz were rising. Living in the upper Yenisei, they had a strong military tradition and were known as tough, rarely forming long-term alliances. In the west, the tribal alliance of the Karluks was growing stronger. They were not enemies of the Uighurs, but it was hard to call them allies either. They acted pragmatically. Where it was beneficial, they supported China, and where it was beneficial, they supported the Turks. There were also other participants on the political stage, such as the Sianto and the Basmils. The Teliot clans, descendants of old alliances, and the Uighurs also did not stand aside and tried to establish their own order. Some of their clans, together with the Teliot tribes, created a short-lived alliance known as the Satardu Khaganate. Little is known about it, and it was not a centralized state in the usual sense, but rather an attempt to maintain stability. In the situation where the former Turkic center had collapsed, not all Uighurs joined the alliance, but mainly those who roamed closer to the Altai and eastern Turkestan. The main part of the Uighurs lived further east in the Orkhon Valley. They also kept their own leaders, their own lands, and their place among the Turkic peoples. The main unifying force became the ancient Yaglakar clan. People trusted its elders because in the traditions of the Tile Uighurs, power was not imposed from above, it was based on respect, and Yaglakar was famous for its ability to maintain the alliance. That's why Tang Dynasty China was forced to take this reality into account. If you want to talk to the Uighurs, you have to talk to Yaglakar. Meanwhile, in the south, the Tang Empire was growing stronger. Its ruler, Li Shimin, understood that it was unrealistic to control the northern steppe lands by force. The Turkic tribes might be defeated and retreat to remote pastures, but fully conquering them was nearly impossible. So, he used the old strategy of defeating the barbarians by using the barbarians themselves. This is how the system of so-called soft control of the Tang appeared. They did not place their own officials over the nomads, but instead supported the power of the local Khan clans and gave them honorary titles. Uighur elders became official administrators in the northern districts. For this, the Chinese invented a bunch of titles, but the main idea was to gain control over the border. To strengthen the influence of the Tang, they began to restore infrastructure in the annexed lands, building about 60 inns, postal stations, and grain warehouses. This was rare for the steppe, but it kept caravan routes open and let troops move faster if needed. For the Uighurs, all of this was beneficial. Trade brought significant profit. Key Silk Road routes crossed their lands, transporting silk, bronze, tea, grain, and handicrafts. Uighurs sent horses, furs, salt, metals, and other steppe goods in the opposite direction. It is no exaggeration to say that China needed these supplies. The Tang army was less effective without Uighur horses, and the imperial court would have been vulnerable without northern furs and salt. In winter, the Uighurs lived at the crossroads of the Chinese, Sogdian, and steppe worlds, which made them an essential partner. Both the Tang and the Western trading centers understood very well that if the Uighurs maintained order at the Yakon, it meant the Silk Road was open, and that meant the economy of half the region was functioning. But trade is only one side of the story. Along with goods, ideas, texts, religions, and craftsmen were also moving, and the Uighurs gradually became cultural intermediaries through the Sogdian merchants. They became acquainted with Manichaeism and Buddhism, with administrative practices through China, and with the military traditions of the Turks through the steppe. But soft control is not just about economic perks, it's also about diplomacy, Tang. They sent gifts, certificates, and honorary badges. Chinese envoys appeared more and more often at the courts of the Uighur Khans, trying to establish personal connections. The Uighurs accepted these gestures but maintained their independence. They understood that honor and gifts are one way of communication, and independence is another, and that it's difficult to combine these two things unless you act carefully. In other words, the Uighurs acted pragmatically. If China offered peace, roads, and trade, then why not accept it? After all, it improved life on the steppe, but they never gave up their own authority or their own lands to anyone. It was during this period that the Yaglakar clan began to strengthen its authority, transforming from a respected clan into a dynasty that would sooner or later lead the Uighurs to their own state. After the fall of the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, the senior leader from the Yaglakar clan, Tumid il-Tabir, took the helm of the Uighur Union at Archon. To the Tang, he was the Hanhai district chief, but in reality, he was still a steppe Khan leading the tribes. China acknowledged his authority, granted titles, but didn't interfere internally. Such a compromise suited everyone, but the foreign policy of the Uighurs was much more complicated than it appeared to Chinese chroniclers. The steppe in those years was filled with forces trying to take the place of the fallen Turkic state. One of these new centers of power was the Sianto Khaganate, founded by Sianto tribes, which sought to control Mongolia and subjugate the Uighurs. Arcona. Yaglakar disliked this, making conflict inevitable. But there was another side to this story. Korea, then known as Goguryeo. The Korean ruler Yongyes Amun in 643 was seeking allies against the growing pressure from Tang. He turned for help to the Uighurs of the Sartadush Khaganate. Li Shimin learned about these contacts and decided to act preemptively, since the formation of such a powerful alliance threatened the northeastern border of Tang. As an ally, he turns to Tumid. It turned out to be a rather intricate alliance, where each participant pursued their own goals. The Tang thought they were using the Uighurs in their struggle against Goguryeo, but in reality, it was the Uighurs who were using the Tang to pressure their own rivals. As a result, the Uighurs and the Tang carried out several joint campaigns against the Xianbei and the Sartadush and defeated them. This victory established for the first time the Uighurs as a force capable of destroying Khaganates, not just reacting to the actions of others. Even Chinese chronicles noted the Uighurs' resilience and unity, uncommon among northern peoples. Tumid's power grows on this wave. He had no intention of becoming a Chinese vassal, and immediately after the victory, he proclaimed himself the Uighur Khagan, which essentially meant declaring his independence and the creation of a new state. This was a bold move, which went against China's policy. Li Shimin, after defeating the Turks and Sogdians, lacked the strength for another major northern war. He had no choice but to formally recognize the Tumid Khaganate, but he was not reconciled to the strengthening of the Uighurs. Li Shimin planned to remove Tumid and replace him with a more obedient ruler. Through their agents, the Chinese contacted Tumid's nephew named Uge, promising the young man that they would make him the Khagan of all the Uighurs if he helped remove the power-hungry ruler. The nephew agreed. He killed Tumid Khagan and several of his close associates, and then hurried to Li Shimin's trusted official, Yan Lichin, to report that the task was accomplished. He also fell victim to Yan Lichin's cunning. Yan Lichin killed Uge to hide the conspiracy. However, the Uighurs were not naive steppe dwellers. When they learned the truth about the conspiracy, the tribes enthroned the son of Tumid Abayan. The new Khagan took the situation into his own hands and showed that the Uighurs would not allow the Tang to control their destiny. Under his rule, the Uighurs entered a period of relative stability. He reinforced the Yaglakar dynasty's authority. If the Tang was a dangerous neighbor to the south, an even more serious threat was approaching from the north. After several decades of decline, the Turkic clans from the Ashina dynasty managed to unite again. In 682, the Turkic prince El-Tarish Khagan, better known as Kutlug, did the incredible. He restored the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, which is also called the Second Eastern Turkic Khaganate. For all of northern Asia, this became a new challenge. The Khaganate began to expand, subjugating tribes, and the Uighurs also felt this pressure. In that same year, 622 Kutlug's troops struck the Uighurs and defeated them. The Uighurs were now trapped between the Turks to the north and the Tang to the south. Such neighbors forced them to make a difficult choice. The Tang had proven treacherous by orchestrating Tumid's assassination, while the Turks reduced the Uighurs to tributaries and held them in subjugation. Choosing the lesser of two evils, the Uighur rulers took a pragmatic path and entered into a temporary alliance with the Tang against Turkic domination. This was not betrayal. It was a cold-blooded political calculation in the spirit of steppe diplomacy. Support the one who will help weaken the main enemy in order to avoid greater losses. Some of the Uighur clans moved to Ordos, to a more protected territory under the control of the Tang Empire. This resettlement shouldn't be viewed as flight or exile. This was typical steppe policy during the era of great migrations, nomads, and the Tang Wars. They took under their wing those clans that agreed to defend the border and serve in the army. The Uighurs in Ordos received land, support, and the opportunity to live without the threat of immediate attack. This group of Uighurs joined the Tang border troops. They knew how to fight in the steppe, knew the routes, and could quickly mobilize in case of danger. Such service gave the Uighurs experience that many other steppe peoples later lacked. That's how they became familiar with Chinese military administration, supply, discipline, and organization. Meanwhile, tensions in Mongolia continued to rise. The new Turkic ruler, Khagan, was building a powerful state and expanding the Ashina's power almost to the same extent as during the first Turkic Khaganate. He was pressuring the Karluks, subjugating the Telyut tribes, and pushing all alliances that didn't fit into his project to the periphery. The Uighurs, who remained in their native lands on the Archon, felt this pressure themselves, but unlike many neighboring tribes, they did not submit to Khagan. Thanks to the strong Yaglakar clan, the Uighurs maintained their autonomy and managed to hold their borders. By 715, the tension between the Eastern Turkic Khaganate and the Uighur Union had sharply escalated. The Uighurs no longer wanted to tolerate being tributaries. And in 716, an event occurred that changed everything. Khagan was returning from another campaign when his entourage was passing through the forests near the Kurlan River. He was ambushed by warriors from the Uighur Bayirkut tribe, and as a result of the skirmish, the Khagan was killed. It was a bold strike that showed the Uighurs were ready to fight for their freedom to the end. It was also a shock for the steppe. The man who ruled nearly all of Inner Asia fell not to an army, but to a targeted strike. After Khagan's death, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate began to weaken rapidly, and the same tribes that had been forced to submit just a few years earlier rose up against it. In the steppe, the Karluks grew stronger, the Bayirku became more active, and the Uighurs confidently defended their lands, resisting Turkic interference in Archon's internal affairs. It became clear that the days of Turkic dominance were numbered. The Uighurs continued to maintain a balance between the Tang and the Turks, kept an eye on relations with neighboring tribes, and at the same time held their own alliance together. As before, some of the Uighurs served China in Ordos, while others held the Archon lands. But it was not the Turks, but rather the local Chinese officials who caused them much more trouble. At this time, in some northern districts of Tang, there appeared administrators who abused their power, collected excessive taxes, demanded gifts, and even interfered in the internal affairs of the tribes. For Tang, this was usually just a bureaucratic problem, but for the nomadic peoples, such interference was seen as a serious insult. This conflict is reflected in Chinese chronicles. The Chinese governor of Lianzhou, named Wan Guncho, behaved as if the northern districts were his personal property. He clashed with the Uighur nobility and punished rulers without any investigation. Once, because of his report, one of them even died in exile after being removed from office. This went on for years and gradually brought the situation to a boiling point. At that moment, a Uighur man decided this could no longer be tolerated. His name was Hushu, a representative of the Yaglakar clan, one of the respected steppe commanders. He did not intend to rebel against Tang as a state. It was more about responding to the abuse of a particular official. When Wang Yuncho left the district to take part in the campaign against the Tibetans, Hu Shu took the opportunity to solve the problem in his own way. He gathered his supporters and attacked, confronting the governor's detachment in a skirmish, and Yuncho was killed. For the Tang, this was an alarming signal, not so much because of the murder itself, but because the north was beginning to slip out of the control of the capital's appointees. The empire responded quickly, sent troops, and restored order. Hu Shu did not have enough forces to resist the imperial army, and he had to retreat to the northern lands, where the Turks were gaining strength. But something else became a more important consequence of the battle. This was the first clear sign that the old relationship model between Stalin and Tan was no longer effective. The Uighurs no longer saw officials as intermediaries, and the officials stopped understanding the specifics of the steppe. The old system of soft control, effective for nearly a century, started to collapse. After Hu Shu left, his son Kutluk Belge took his place in the alliance. When he took power, the Uighur alliance's situation was complicated. The Tang administration was no longer the reliable partner it used to be. In the north, the Ashina Turks were active, still holding on to the idea of subjugating all their neighbors. In the west, the Karluks were rising, while the Basmils gained strength in the central steppe. The Uighurs needed a leader who could lead them out of this chaos, and Kutluk Belge turned out to be just such a person. Kutluk Belge did not rush into drastic actions. First, he restored the authority of the Yaglakar clan, gathered dissatisfied clans around him, and re-established connections between the eastern and western groups of Uighurs. Kutluk realized that without unity, the Uighurs would fall under Tang or Turk influence. Only their own strength could give them freedom of action. By the early 740s, Central Asia faced a crisis. The second Turkic Khaganate, which had recently seemed like a powerful state, was rapidly losing control over the tribes. Its ruler Usukan found himself in an extremely difficult situation. The Basmils were the first to rebel, defeated him, and forced him to flee the capital. Some Turkic leaders chose not to wait and joined the Chinese, while the Uighurs saw this as the opportunity they'd awaited for decades. Uighur sources, as recorded in the Mayanchur inscriptions, state that Usukan and his wife were captured by the Uighurs. The Chinese chronicles tell a different story, saying that he was killed by the Basmils, and his head was delivered to the Chinese emperor in Chang'an, where the emperor even ordered it to be displayed in one of the temples, as a sign that the northern threat had been eliminated. At that time, political correspondence between the steppe and the Celestial Empire operated in a unique way, especially with the Khagans. The fall of Usukan became the point of no return. The old Turkic center of power disappeared, and the steppe needed a new order. At this moment, three forces emerged: the Uighurs, Basmils, and Karluks. Their union was not an alliance out of affection, but rather a pragmatic calculation, since each wanted to strengthen their position before the Ashina power finally collapsed. Led by Kutluk Bilge, the Uighurs joined the alliance as the most organized force. The Basmils aimed to sustain their success after overthrowing Usukan, while the Karluks saw an opportunity to escape Turkish pressure and expand their territory. In 742, the Triple Alliance was formed, destroying the old Khaganate. However, after the Turkic power fell, the alliance quickly began to unravel. The Basmils made the first move. Their leader, Tsedeishi, proclaimed himself the new Turkic Khagan. The Uighur and Karluk leaders received only the positions of junior partners, Yabgu of the left and right hand. For Kutluk Bilge, this was unacceptable. The Uighurs were the most numerous and powerful people in the Union. He waited, gathered supporters, enlisted the Karluks, and struck in 744. In the decisive battle, the Basmil Khagan was defeated and killed. And Chinese chronicles once again note a familiar detail. His head was sent to Chang'an, just like the head of Usukan. The emperor clearly liked it when proof of victory could be seen in person. Well, it's convenient after all. Let the steppe people kill each other while Tang just watches. No one was left to resist after that. In that same year, 744, Kutluk Bilge declared himself Khagan of all the Uighurs. The Tang Dynasty recognized him and granted him the title of Ivan the Righteous Prince. That's how the Uighur Khaganate appeared on the map. It is worth noting that the Uighurs did not destroy the Turkic world or set themselves against their neighbors. On the contrary, they became the people who managed to maintain order where other states could not. The establishment of the Uighur Khaganate marks a new chapter in their history. A time of major reforms, the flourishing of writing, diplomacy, and that very role of a buffer, which would define the region's history for many centuries to come. But that's a different story. Thank you for watching the video until the end. See you next time.